Hello, everyone. Welcome to AraboFascism Part 2. I think this will probably be Part 2 and the conclusion. I don't really have very much left to say, but I'll begin by sort of recapping what I said in Part 1, noting that the term Arab was ambiguous and fissile and ultimately meaningless, except in doctrinaire circles. I also mentioned that even committed Arab nationalists themselves are incapable of coming to a single, coherent, satisfying definition of their own identity parameters. For instance, I gave the example of the Arab League, how it defines an Arab as being anyone who is in sympathy with the aspirations of the Arabic speaking people. Uh, I personally am in, or you can say that I am in sympathy with the aspirations of the French speaking people, except that, this partly works because there is a collective of French speaking people. There is no collective of Arabic speaking people. But I still don't know what the aspirations of these people are. So, so those terms are elusive and ambiguous and ultimately meaningless, Arabic-speaking people and their aspirations. I also provided a sampling of other ominous definitions of Arab nationalism that are spouted by what I call genocidal characters, really, even though they're lionized as the intellectual heroes of Arab nationalism. People like Michel Aflaq, Sati al-Husri, Omar Farouk, and others. By the way, with regards to Omar Farouk, I mentioned the name of his book in Arabic, and I mistakenly called it Al-Urub al-Fusha. The title of the book is Al-Qawmiyya al-Arabiyya al-Fusha, uh, Modern Standard Arabic Nationalism in English. So anyway, these people advocated the outright erasure, and in the words of Michel Aflaq, the extermination of those rejecting Arabism, so that Arabism itself may triumph and live on. But still, in spite of this, they still do not provide a coherent, intelligible, understandable, unified, uniform um, um, definition of what an Arab is. Finally, there is Islam, the elephant in the room that is rarely mentioned, but that Arab nationalist ideologues also do mention and recognize, actually, the centrality of Islam, even among those so called secular Arab nationalists. Islam remains foundational. And note how Saddam Hussein, for instance, the poster child of secular Ba'athist ideology, transformed the Iraqi flag in the early 1990s by writing with his own blood Allahu Akbar on the central white band of the Iraqi flag. Another sadist Arab Ba'athist, uh, our friend Hafiz al-Assad, had to get a special fatwa from Musa Sadr in the early 1970s, Lebanon, had to get a certificate from Musa Sadr declaring the Alawites as Shiite Muslims, so that the secular Ba'athist Assad can have constitutional legitimacy as president for life of the Syrian Arab Republic. Um, yeah, it's kind of comical, but the Syrian Arab Republic does have a constitution, and the constitution does require that the president of Syria be a Muslim. So again, an example of a so-called secularist advocating for a secular ideology, the Ba'ath, had to sort of prove um, his Muslim credentials in order to be a believable Arab or an acceptable Arab. Um, so Islam is central to Arabism, whichever way you define Arabism. See Sylvia Chaim's uh, Arab Nationalism and Anthology. It's an excellent book. It's very old, but it's still very relevant. She provides excellent translations of basic texts of Arab nationalism. And I'm going to pick a few nuggets from her book and her translations of common slogans and bits of speeches given by Arab nationalist ideologues. This particular segment is going to be about the centrality of Islam to Arab nationalism. Anwar Abdul Malik says, quote, the relationship between Islam and Arabism is not a relationship between two separate parties. Rather, it is a relationship of an organic, radical, and formative tie. Adil Hussein, another Arab nationalist ideologue, I think he's an Egyptian, notes that Islam is the other face of Arabism. Muna Hassullah, a Lebanese intellectual, writes that Islam is another name for Arab nationalism. There is no non-Muslim Arab. That is, if the Arab is true to his Arabism, there's no love for Arabs that could be coupled with repulsion from or rejection of Islam, just as there is no loyalty in Islam that could be coupled with or conspiring against Arabs. Naji Maruf writes, quote, the Arab, if he takes his Arabism to the end, is closer to Islam, and the Muslim, if he takes his Islam to the end, is closer to Arabism. None other than Michel Aflaq wrote that Islam is to Arabism what bones are to the flesh. This is the Christian Greek Orthodox Damascene co-founder of the Ba'ath Party as a secular party, the Arab Ba'ath Party, and recognizes again the centrality of Islam. In any case, Michel Aflaq converted to Islam at the end of his life, or at least there's a rumor that he did convert to Islam, and he was referred to by the sort of the inner coterie of followers as Dr. Muhammad, not Dr. Michel. He was not a physician. And finally, going back to the Arab League, the seal, the official seal of the Arab League, is emblazoned with a Quranic surah, Surat Al-Umran 110. Kuntum khayru ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You are the finest nation that was brought forth to mankind. Of course, the Arab League is speaking about the Arab nation, but the description here is patently Quranic. So the nation of Islam, you are the finest ummah, you are the finest nation, Muslims, that was brought forth to mankind. The ideology, for all intents and purposes, is dead. But the doctrinaires that keep sort of trying to shove it down people's throats, especially in Lebanon, have themselves not died. There was an observer attending a 1994 Arab Nationalist Convention in Beirut. And of all places, Beirut, the least Arab of Arab capitals, hosts this Arab Nationalist Convention. I don't know. I don't see the logic of that. But this observer pointedly condensed in his description, he condensed the ill-defined and ill-adjusted ideology of Arab nationalism, which from his description appeared to be a corpse, but a corpse that was still unconvinced of its own death. And he writes, quote, from where I sat, the Arab nationalist conferees appeared to represent an extinct tribe using strange words, indeed a language unintelligible in our time. Most of them had gray hair and stooping backs. Some needed canes to help them walk. Some had hearing aids and shaking hands that made it difficult for them to write, and others had difficulty getting the words out. Astonishingly, he continues, none of this stopped them, even as they were blowing in a broken bagpipe, end quote. So in the end, this is an indictment of a century or more of a certain doctrine advancing a genocidal form of intellectual rigidity, an intellectual rigidity that has for far too long colored common perceptions of the Middle East, all for the sake of what I call fascist conformity and orthodoxy that have zero historical justification in the Near East, Lebanon specifically. Ultimately, the idea of an Arab or an Arab nation or an Arabic speaking people is a Western, not an Arab construct. It is a notion that represents the triumph of a Western, not an Eastern, nor even an Arab conception of identity. It was, in fact, the Western habit of referring to Arabic speaking Muslims as Arab because of their language. It was this idea, uh, on the analogy of German speakers as Germans and French speakers as Frenchmen and so on. It was this idea that imposed itself on an East that had never regarded language as a basic social classifier. This is a quote from historian Joel Carmichael. Joel Carmichael. He writes, "It was natural for Europeans to use the word Arab about a Muslim. In French, there's this expression describing someone who is strong, who's powerful. Um, they say fort comme un Turc. This comes from the 19th century, 18th, 19th century expression, fort comme un Turc, strong like a Turk, but it doesn't mean Turk as in a Turkish speaker. It means as a Muslim. That was the term in 19th, 18th, 19th century France, uh, post-revolutionary France, that did not refer to people by the name of their religions, because France had at the time relinquished its role as the elder daughter of the Catholic Church. So fort comme un Turc means fort comme un musulman, and the Turk was the representative of the Muslim nation at the time. Today, the French use the term Arab, to mean Muslims, especially the Muslims who live in France. So anyway, it was natural for European to use terms such as Arab about a Muslim whose native language might have been Arabic, but they were at the same time quite indifferent to the principles of classification in the East itself. The oddity is simply that this European habit became the very germ that the contemporary Arab nationalist movement has sprung from. Add to the preceding a touch of etymology, and the plot thickens. I'm not going to dwell too long on etymology. This is widely accessible on the internet. You can see what the term Arab means, etymologically speaking. But according to philologist and historian Tim McIntosh Smith, the term Arab is a label that is very broad, very sticky, and at the same time, very slippery. It has signified different things to different people at different times, but in some, whatever its place or time, the term always referred to tribal groups who live beyond the reach of settled societies. It is for this very same reason that an Egyptian today would take great umbrage at being referred to as an Arab, because I'm talking about Egyptian Muslims. They reject the notion that they're Arab because the term Arab to them means a nomad. And this is a child of a 4,000 or 5,000 year history of settled society, right? The Egyptians, the pharaohs, etc. The term Arab, so in a sense, in reference to nomads, this is the common terminology used in the Arabic language in reference to nomad, urban in Arabic, and from it the variant Arab. It would be analogous to referring to Native Americans in toto as Indians when they already benefit from their own distinct ethnonyms and cultural attributes and historical accretions. I realize the analogy here isn't ironclad. Native Americans did not conquer and colonize the Near East, but you get what I'm trying to get at. So saying an Arab is like saying an Indian, an American Indian, or a cowboy for that matter. You could say that the term Arab means it has the same ethnic and cultural significance as the term cowboy. The term Arab historically meant just that, not a cowboy, but a I don't know, a sheep boy, um, or a mutton boy. It was a cowboy adjacent term, not referring to cow herders, but indeed a generic reference to nomadic peoples roaming the deserts, eking out a living, grazing their camels and livestock in oases, warring, making alliances, trading, collecting booty, but always benefiting from their own specific tribal names: Aus, Nizar, Qaynuqa, Kulayb, etc. They were Arabs only to those describing them from the outside, not to themselves. They referred to themselves by their ethnic names, tribal names, if you will, not by the generic term Arab. So, in sum, uh, Arab is not an ethnonym. It is not a reference to a single discrete people, but rather to a fissile, reactive lot that only one thing seems to unite them: their inability to come to a single coherent definition of what they are, their inability to get along with each other, and today, in the case of Arabo-fascists, their rejection of all historical realities suggesting Arab nationalism and rigid, coerced, Arab defined identities are intruder doctrinaire notions in a region, Lebanon specifically in my case, a region defined by millennia of cultural, linguistic, historical, and geological accretions. In conclusion, and paraphrasing Tim McIntosh Smith again, an Arab in the modern Near East, the Levant specifically, Lebanon more specifically, an Arab would be analogous to a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, a WASP, an intruder, somebody conquering an area that is not his. So, so, so in the modern Middle East, this would be a WASP in a New York City subway in the middle of rush hour, a topos and transmitter of a language that is at best an oddity, not to say an intruder, hardly representative of New York City's wider ethnic, cultural, and linguistic stew. So that's my piece on Arabo-fascism. This concludes Arabo-fascism Part 1 and Part 2. I wish all my Arabo-fascist friends and acquaintances a happy new year, and may 2022 tread lighter on all of us, you specifically. Ciao.